On June 15, 2019, Lisa Marie Presley sat alone in a quiet office room inside Graceland. The house was open to tourists that day. Footsteps echoed in distant halls. Voices floated faintly through velvet ropes and polished floors. Visitors whispered near the jungle room. Cameras flashed near the piano. Outside, buses unloaded fans who had traveled from all over the world to stand where Elvis once stood. But inside the administrative wing, the atmosphere felt different. Still, private, heavy. Lisa Marie was 51 years old. Old enough to carry memory like stone. Old enough to carry grief without collapsing. Old enough to understand that legacy is both gift and weight. For 42 years, she had lived in the shadow of August 16, 1977. She had been 9 years old when her father died. 9. Old enough to remember his laugh. Old enough to remember how his voice filled a room. Old enough to remember sitting beside him at the piano. But too young to understand mortality. Too young to understand exhaustion. Too young to understand how fragile even legends can be. Across the table from her sat a man named Daniel Harper. 70 years old. Former sound engineer. Quiet hands. Careful eyes. He had worked briefly at RCA Studios in Memphis during the 1970s. Not famous, not high-ranking, not someone whose name appeared in liner notes, but he had been there. And 3 weeks earlier, he had called Graceland. He had said he had something that belonged to Lisa Marie. Something recorded in August 1977. Something her father had never intended the world to hear. Lisa Marie had heard those claims before. Collectors, impersonators, men with basement tapes, women with lost interviews. Everyone seemed to have something. But Daniel had not asked for money. He had not asked for publicity. He had not threatened to sell it. He had only said one sentence that made her pause. He asked me to keep it until she was old enough to understand it. Now the object sat between them. A small archival metal case. Dull silver. Worn edges. Heavy latch. Daniel rested his hand gently on it. "I've kept this in climate storage since 1977, he said quietly. "I never made a copy, I never played it for anyone. I was instructed to wait." Lisa Marie's lawyer had already verified Daniel's employment records. The tape casing had been examined. The label ink matched the era. The handwriting on the front had been compared against authenticated samples. It was her father's handwriting. Simple, direct, for Lisa Marie when she is ready. No dramatic instruction. No sensational note. Just that. Lisa Marie stared at the case. 42 years. What does a message survive after 42 years? What survives inside silence? Daniel continued gently. He came in late, August 12th. It wasn't a music session, no band, no production, just him and a microphone. He said he wanted to record something personal, something that wasn't for radio, not for record, not for business. Lisa Marie swallowed. He was tired that night, Daniel added softly. But very clear, very focused. He said some things need time before they can be understood. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Outside, a tour guide's voice echoed faintly. "And this is the room where Elvis often played piano late at night." Late at night. Her father had loved the night. He had always seemed most awake after midnight. Most honest. Most vulnerable. Lisa Marie finally spoke. "Why wait this long?" Daniel looked down at his hands. He said children hear differently than adults. He said some words can become burdens if heard too early. That sentence pierced something inside her. She had spent decades replaying old interviews, old footage, old performances, searching for hidden meanings in his smiles, looking for clues in pauses, trying to understand the man beyond the myth. Now here was something direct. Something unfiltered. Not for fans. Not for history. For her. She stood slowly. "Play it." Daniel carefully opened the case. Inside rested a reel-to-reel tape, preserved in protective wrapping. He handled it with reverence. The playback machine had been brought in specifically for this moment. Vintage, serviced, calibrated. He threaded the tape with steady fingers. The click of metal. The soft mechanical whir. The faint hiss of analog readiness. Lisa Marie sat. Her hands rested in her lap. Her breathing shallow. She had heard her father's voice thousands of times in recordings. But never something new. Never something meant only for her. Daniel pressed play. Static. Soft tape hiss. A slight microphone adjustment. Then, his voice. Clear. Low. Familiar. Hey, baby girls. Lisa Marie's heart stopped. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. Gentle. Unperforming. No stage presence. No charisma for an audience. Just father. Hey, baby girl, if you're hearing this, you're not little anymore. Lisa Marie closed her eyes. Her 9-year-old self flashed before her. Sitting cross-legged on the floor. Watching him tune a guitar. Waiting for him to look down and smile. I don't know how old you are when you hear this, the voice continued softly. But I'm guessing you're grown. I'm guessing you've seen some things. I'm guessing you've learned that life ain't always as bright as the stage lights. He paused. The faint sound of breath near the microphone. I wanted to leave you something that ain't public, ain't polished, ain't part of the show. Lisa Marie's fingers tightened. For most of my life, people told me who I was, the king, the performer, the symbol. But when you were born, I just wanted to be dad. Her throat tightened. You made me feel human in a world that treated me like a headline. The room felt sacred now. Time collapsed. 1977 and 2019 folded into each other. I know I ain't perfect, he continued gently. I know there are things I could have done better, things I should have done slower. I chased a lot of noise, and sometimes I got lost in it. Lisa Marie breathed slowly. I don't know what you've heard about me when you're older. Folks like to rewrite stories. But I hope when you think of me, you remember the quiet mornings, pancakes in the kitchen, riding around the grounds, me sitting at the piano while you danced in your pajamas. Tears rolled silently down her face. He remembered. He had noticed. I'm recording this because I don't want you growing up thinking you were ever second to the music. Or second to the crowds. You were. You never were. Lisa Marie pressed her palm against her mouth. You were the only room where I didn't have to perform. The tape hissed softly. A gentle silence between words. I don't know how long I'll be around. Life's funny that way, but I want you to know something real simple. Another breath. You are not responsible for carrying my name. Her eyes opened. She stared at the spinning reel. You don't owe the world anything because of who I am. You don't owe the fans. You don't owe the history books. You just owe yourself a life that feels honest. Lisa Marie felt something shift inside her. For decades, she had felt responsible for the Presley name. Responsible for protecting it. Defending it. Maintaining it. Now this voice from 1977 gently released that weight. You're gonna hear a lot of noise about legacy, but legacy ain't a museum. It's how you love people when nobody's watching. He laughed softly. You don't gotta sing like me. You don't gotta live like me. Lord knows you shouldn't live like me. A faint smile through tears. I just hope you grow up knowing you were loved without condition. Another pause. The tape crackled slightly. I ain't always known how to show it right, but I felt it every single day. Silence. Then, be free, Lisa, not famous, not perfect, free. The tape ended with the soft click of analog completion. The reel stopped turning. The room was silent. Lisa Marie did not move. She did not speak. She simply sat with it. For 42 years, she had lived with absence. Now she had been given presence. Not conspiracy. Not scandal. Not secrets. Just a father. Just a man trying to speak honestly before time ran out. Daniel quietly stopped the machine. I never listened to it before today, he said gently. I didn't feel it was mine to hear. Lisa Marie stood slowly. She walked to the window. Outside, tourists continued to walk the grounds. Life moved forward. She whispered softly, almost to herself. I thought I had to carry him. She placed her hand against the glass. He was trying to carry me. And in that quiet office at Graceland, something healed. Not history, not grief, but something deeper. A child who had always wondered if she had been enough. And now finally knew. Lisa Marie didn't leave the conference room right away after the reel stopped turning. She stayed seated, still facing the machine as if the tape might suddenly begin again, as if her father's voice might return with one more sentence, one more breath, one more small detail that would explain everything she had been trying to understand since childhood. The room felt strangely unchanged, like any other office space where papers were signed and decisions were made. Yet it had become something else entirely the moment that familiar voice said, "Hey, baby girl," and turned 42 years into a single living moment. She had expected to feel shock, maybe even fear, the way people do when a ghost touches a shoulder in the dark. But what came instead was a heavy calm, the kind that settles after a storm when you realize the roof is still standing. Her tears weren't the dramatic kind that come with sudden heartbreak. They were slow and quiet, like rain seeping into soil that has been dry for too long. Daniel Harper sat patiently across from her, keeping his hands folded, not speaking, as if he understood that anything said too quickly could crack the fragile shape of what had just formed inside her. Lisa Marie noticed how his gaze avoided the tape, not because he didn't respect it, but because he respected her. He had carried something sacred for decades, and now, having delivered it, he didn't want to take even a second of it for himself. Stillness stretched until it felt almost physical, and in that stillness Lisa Marie became aware of something she hadn't anticipated. The message didn't give her answers about her father's death, or the hard machinery of the world that chewed up his energy and spit out a legend. It gave her something rarer and somehow more difficult. It gave her permission. Permission not to perform grief. Permission not to protect the myth at the cost of her own peace. Permission to be a daughter instead of a curator. When she finally stood, her movement was slow, like her body needed time to adjust to the fact that the past had just reached forward and touched her. She walked toward the window again, not because she had a speech to give or a decision ready, but because she needed to look outside and anchor herself in something ordinary. Tourists wandered the grounds in clusters, some holding phones, some holding hands, some standing quietly as though they were listening for echoes. It struck her how many people came to Graceland seeking closeness to a man they never met, while she, his actual daughter, had spent most of her life trying to create distance from the version of him the world demanded. As a child, she had wanted him back, not as Elvis, but as Dad, and as an adult she had often felt like she was living in a house that belonged to everyone except her. Even now, she could almost hear the world in the hallways, pressing its face against the glass, wanting access to anything that felt new, wanting proof that the legend still had undiscovered rooms. The tape in that machine was not a room for the world. It was a room for her. That truth hardened into something protective in her chest, and for the first time since the recording started she felt a flicker of something like anger. Not at Daniel, not at the tape, not at the fans, but at the long history of entitlement that had followed her family like a shadow, the endless demand for more. More details, more artifacts, more confessions, more tragedy packaged into stories that strangers could consume for entertainment. The message she had just heard was not entertainment. It was not content. It was not a collectible. It was her father speaking to her like a human being. And that meant it didn't belong to the world, even if the world believed it did. Daniel asked gently if she wanted to hear it again, and Lisa Marie surprised herself by saying no. Not because she didn't want to, but because she sensed that replaying it immediately would turn it into something else, something repetitive, something that could lose its power through familiarity. She had learned over time that pain can become addictive when you keep touching it to confirm it's real, and she didn't want to do that with this. She wanted the message to remain alive inside her, not worn down like a song played too many times on the radio. Her lawyer, who had been present in the first meeting and kept a respectful distance during playback, asked what she wanted to do with the tape now, where it would be stored, who would have access, what legal protections should be applied. The questions were practical, responsible, necessary, and still they felt almost offensive in the wake of those words, because legal language didn't know how to hold the shape of love. Lisa Marie turned back toward the machine and watched the tape reel as if it were a small planet that had finished a long orbit and returned home. She asked Daniel one question that had been waiting behind her teeth since the moment the call came 3 weeks ago. Why him? Why trust a studio engineer with something so intimate? Daniel's answer was quiet and simple. Because Elvis had noticed him, and Elvis was always noticing the people nobody else noticed. Daniel explained that in those last sessions there were moments when the room would go silent, the band would wait, the producer would check levels, and Elvis would glance toward the booth where the engineers worked. He would nod sometimes, a small acknowledgement, and it made the long hours feel less like machinery and more like community. Elvis had asked Daniel once casually if he had kids. Daniel had said yes, a daughter. Elvis had paused for a beat and said something like, "A daughter'll teach you how to be honest." When Elvis came in that August night for the private recording, Daniel said he was alone, more solemn than usual, and he asked for Daniel specifically, not because Daniel was the best engineer in the building, but because Daniel felt safe to him. Safe people are rare when you're famous. Safe people don't ask for pieces of you. Safe people don't sell your softness. Elvis had chosen a safe person to carry a message meant for the one person he wanted to be safe. After Daniel left, Lisa Marie didn't go back to the mansion where tourists walked past velvet ropes and snapped photos. Instead, she went to a smaller private room deeper inside the administrative area, a space that wasn't part of the tour and didn't belong to the performance of history. There was a worn sofa and a table with old books and a framed photograph of Elvis holding her when she was very small, his face turned toward her with that protective tenderness the cameras rarely caught. She sat there alone and let herself remember not the headlines, not the debates about his health or his pressures, but the small sensory details of being his daughter, the smell of his cologne mixed with cigarette smoke, the way his rings felt cool against her cheek when he kissed her forehead, the low hum of his voice when he sang nonsense to make her laugh. Those memories had always existed, but they had been buried under the weight of what the world thought it knew. The recording didn't create new memories, it cleared a path to the old ones. It reminded her that her father's love hadn't been theoretical, it had been daily, present, imperfect, and real. She realized that one of the hardest parts of losing him young wasn't just the loss itself, but the decades afterward when strangers argued about him as if he were a concept, as if he belonged to them. People spoke about Elvis with certainty. But Dad was the one person nobody could truly access but her, and she had spent years feeling guilty for wanting that version more than the iconic one. Now the tape had given her proof that he wanted to be Dad more than he wanted to be anything else, and that realization didn't erase the grief. It rearranged it into something she could carry without feeling like she was being crushed. That night she stayed at Graceland. It wasn't a dramatic decision, it was simply the only place that felt true. A hotel would have felt like hiding, and going back to Los Angeles immediately would have felt like running. She walked through a hallway after closing hours when the staff had gone home and the tour lights were dimmed, and the house sounded the way it must have sounded when she was a child, quiet enough for footsteps to matter, quiet enough for breath to be heard. She stopped outside rooms she remembered and some she didn't. She paused near the piano and ran her fingers lightly over the smooth surface, not playing, not performing, just touching it the way you touch something that was once alive with presence. In her mind, she heard the tape again. "You are not responsible for carrying my name." That sentence kept returning like a refrain, not because it was poetic, but because it was impossible. She had been carrying his name since she could walk. She had carried it in school, in relationships, in interviews, in every public mistake turned into spectacle. Even her private suffering had always been interpreted through the Presley lens, as if pain was less real if it came with fame. What did it mean to set down something you'd never known how to remove? What did it mean to be free when the world knew your last name before it knew your first? In the early hours of the morning, she made tea and sat at a kitchen table where no cameras were allowed and no tour guide would ever point. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't open. She knew how this world worked. Someone had seen her arrive, someone had recognized her, someone had posted something vague online, and soon there would be speculation. Why was she at Graceland? What meeting? What project? What secret? That was the rhythm of her life, people taking normal moments and turning them into narrative. She didn't want a narrative tonight. She wanted honesty. She wanted to sit with the weight of her father's voice and let it change her from the inside without the world narrating it in real time. She stared at the tea as the steam rose and vanished and thought about how her father had talked about freedom on the tape, not fame, not perfection, just freedom. She had always associated freedom with leaving Graceland, with escaping the place where everything smelled like him, and yet he wasn't there. But now she wondered if freedom might mean the opposite, staying long enough to reclaim it not as a shrine, but as a home that belonged to her memories, not to the public's hunger. Over the next few days, the message followed her in quiet ways. It wasn't like a movie where a revelation triggers a dramatic montage of transformation. It was subtler and more realistic, the way real change happens when you don't notice it happening at first. She found herself listening differently when people said his name. She found herself less reactive to the familiar rhetoric. When someone in her orbit mentioned the legacy or the brand, she noticed how those words turned a human being into a product, and she felt a new protective boundary form inside her. The tape didn't make her love her father more. She had loved him all her life. It made her love herself differently because if he had loved her without condition, without performance, then perhaps she could begin to do the same. She began to see how often she had punished herself for being messy, for being complicated, for being a woman who didn't fit the public's idea of what Elvis's daughter should look like. She had spent years feeling as though she failed at being a symbol, but the tape made it clear she had never been meant to be one. She had been meant to be a person. On the fourth day after hearing the recording, she returned to the administrative wing and asked to see the tape again, not to play it, but to hold it. The staff brought it out in its protective case. When it was placed in her hands, she was surprised by how ordinary it looked, like something that could sit unnoticed on a shelf, like something that didn't belong to a myth at all. She thought about how many artifacts people would kill to own, and yet this one, perhaps the most personal of all, had sat in quiet storage for decades because one man had chosen integrity over attention. That thought made her grateful in a way she couldn't fully express. She asked Daniel Harper to come back one last time. When he arrived, she didn't speak about business or legalities first. She simply said thank you, and this time the words landed with the full weight they deserved. Daniel's eyes watered, and he looked embarrassed by it, like a man who didn't consider himself part of history. Lisa Marie told him she understood something now that she hadn't understood before, that her father had survived so long not only because of talent, but because of small pockets of humanity around him, people like Daniel who treated him like a man, not a machine. She asked Daniel how he carried it for so long without playing it, without letting curiosity win, without taking even a tiny piece of it for himself. Daniel answered with the truth. It wasn't easy. There were nights when he wanted to hear it, nights when he imagined the voice would comfort him too, but he remembered his own daughter, and he remembered Elvis's expression when he said, "This is for her." Daniel said something that stayed with Lisa Marie for years afterward. Some things are sacred because you don't touch them. In a world that tried to monetize everything, that principle felt almost radical. Later that week, Lisa Marie met privately with the small team that handled estate matters. She did not tell them what the message contained. She did not frame it as a discovery or a product or a future documentary. She said only that a personal recording had been delivered and that it would be secured under the highest privacy protections. She watched their faces carefully to see if anyone looked disappointed. Some did, and that confirmed her instinct. Even within legacy operations, the world's appetite for content always hovered. But she didn't blame them entirely. The Elvis machine had been running for decades, and machines are built to produce output. Lisa Marie was not trying to dismantle the machine overnight. She was trying to carve out a human space inside it, a space where Dad could exist without being turned into a headline. She arranged for the tape to be sealed, cataloged, and stored in a secure private archive accessible only to her, with written instructions prohibiting duplication. She made sure there would be no accidental leak, no misplaced copy, no casual sharing in the name of culture. She knew how quickly the world could ruin something pure by turning it into public property. The message had given her peace, and she refused to let the world steal that peace by demanding it for itself. That same month, she began to notice how the message changed the way she spoke to her own children. Not in dramatic speeches, not in perfect parental wisdom, but in small decisions. The way she slowed down, the way she listened more patiently, the way she tried to let them be themselves without attaching expectation to their names. For years, she had feared she might repeat the patterns of distance and pressure that fame creates, the way it interrupts ordinary family rhythms. She had feared she might not know how to be simple because her life had never been simple. But the tape gave her a template that was not about money or power or image. It was about presence. It was a father saying, "I see you." It was a father insisting, "You don't owe the world anything." She realized how rarely anyone had said that to her in a way that felt true. The world always wanted something. Even love sometimes came with expectation. But that tape, those few minutes, were love without extraction. She began to offer that kind of love more deliberately, and although she could not undo the pain of what her children had witnessed in her life, she could offer them something stronger than regret. She could offer them honesty. Still, as healing began, a new tension emerged, one that felt inevitable once the message took root. Lisa Marie knew that the world would never stop wanting more, and the more she protected the tape, the more valuable it became in the public imagination. She began to fear the simplest danger, not villains, not dramatic conspiracies, but ordinary human failure, a staff member saying the wrong thing, a careless comment overheard, a security breach, a friend's curiosity, a journalist's pressure. A person's hunger for relevance. Fame doesn't always destroy through cruelty, sometimes it destroys through carelessness. Lisa Marie had seen private letters become headlines, private photos become clickbait, private pain become entertainment. She told herself she could protect this, and yet she also knew that nothing stays fully safe forever. The tape was a living vulnerability. It was a piece of her father that could be taken from her again, this time not by death, but by exposure. That fear brought a question she couldn't ignore. Was the safest way to protect the message to lock it away, or to remove it entirely? The thought made her stomach twist. Destroying it would mean losing his voice forever, and even though she carried the words in memory, she knew memory fades at the edges. Yet keeping it meant risking that one day it might escape into a world that would not handle it gently. She didn't want the world to dissect his tone or argue over meaning or monetize his tenderness. She didn't want strangers to turn her private healing into their public debate. She didn't want her father's softest moment to become a headline that people would weaponize for clicks. One afternoon, she returned to the garden behind Graceland where the air smelled of summer heat and cut grass. She walked alone among the trees, listening to insects and distant traffic, and tried to imagine what her father would advise if he were there. She remembered the line, "Some words can become burdens if heard too early." She realized that burden can also come from hearing something too publicly. The tape was not meant to be communal therapy for the world. It was meant to be a private bridge between father and daughter. The longer she carried it, the more she understood that privacy was not selfishness. Privacy was respect. It was the boundary that keeps love from being turned into spectacle. She sat on a bench and let herself cry again, not because she was breaking, but because grief was changing shape inside her. She was mourning the years she didn't get. She was mourning the man who wanted to be dad more than he wanted to be icon. She was mourning the fact that even now, even after all this time, she still had to protect him from the world that adored him. That evening she made her first decision that felt truly hers in a long time. She did not announce it. She did not tell the press. She did not wrap it in public language. She simply called one person, someone she trusted with her private self, not her public identity. She asked that person to come to Graceland quietly, to sit with her, to listen if needed, to be present while she figured out what to do. That person arrived after dark, and they sat in the same small private room where Lisa Marie had first let the message settle in. Lisa Marie didn't play the tape. She didn't share the words. She only said, "I heard him. I finally heard him." And then, for the first time in years, she talked about her father without speaking like a spokesperson. She talked like a daughter. She talked about what it felt like to carry a name that never let her rest. She talked about how anger and love can exist together. She talked about how she had sometimes felt guilty for being tired of the myth, as if being tired meant she didn't love him enough. And then she said something that surprised even her. "He asked me to be free, but I don't know how." The person across from her didn't give advice. They didn't offer cliches. They simply said, "Then we'll start small, we'll start real." And in that simple response, Lisa Marie felt something loosen in her chest, because the message had done what it was meant to do. It had opened a door. It hadn't solved everything. It hadn't erased the past. But it had given her a new beginning, one grounded not in performance, but in truth. By the end of summer 2019, Lisa Marie began to restructure how she interacted with the legacy she had inherited. Not by rejecting it, not by publicly battling it, but by quietly centering herself within it. She attended fewer events that felt like obligation and more moments that felt like meaning. She redirected certain public-facing decisions toward respect rather than spectacle. She began writing privately again, not for publication, but for her own clarity. She wrote letters to her father she would never send, and she discovered that grief can be a conversation even when the other person is gone. She wrote about her childhood memories, not as tabloid anecdotes, but as emotional truths. The warmth of his arms, the sadness in his eyes when he thought nobody was watching, the way he tried to make her laugh when he was exhausted. And as she wrote, she realized something profound. The world might never know her father the way she did, but it also didn't need to. Love doesn't require witnesses. In fact, sometimes love survives only when it remains unwitnessed, protected, unconsumed. Yet beneath the growing calm, one unresolved thread continued to tug, the tape itself, the physical object, the real, the fact that his voice existed somewhere outside her body. She could feel its presence like a heartbeat in a locked room. She knew where it was stored, and that knowledge comforted her, but it also haunted her. She began to dream about it, not dramatic nightmares, but quiet dreams where she walked down a hallway and heard faint music behind a door, or dreams where she held a small metal case and couldn't remember where she had placed it. The dreams weren't about conspiracy or danger. They were about fear of loss. She had lost him once. Now she feared losing him again in a different way, and she began to understand that the tape had become more than a message. It had become a symbol of her relationship with the past, precious, fragile, and always at risk of being stolen by time or by the world. She did not yet know what she would do. She only knew that eventually she would have to choose, keep it, protect it, or let it go in a way that honored what it was meant to be. And that choice slowly, quietly, began to form the central question of her life after 2019. When you are given a piece of someone you loved, something real and private and sacred, do you hold it forever, or do you release it so it can't be taken from you? Lisa Marie had spent her life being told what to do with her father's legacy. Now, for the first time, she faced a decision that was not about business or public image, but about love. And love, she was learning, is not measured by how loudly you keep something alive. Sometimes it is measured by how gently you protect it, even if protection means letting it disappear from the world entirely. By early autumn of 2019, the message had stopped feeling like a moment and started feeling like a responsibility. Not a burden in the old sense, the way her father's name had once felt heavy on her shoulders, but a different kind of responsibility, one rooted in intention. Lisa Marie woke most mornings with the same quiet awareness that somewhere, inside a temperature-controlled vault, rested a reel of tape carrying the most unguarded version of her father's voice. It wasn't fear that greeted her when she thought about it. It was vigilance. She had lived long enough in the public eye to know that nothing connected to Elvis Presley remained invisible for long. The world had a way of sensing when something existed, even if it didn't know what that something was. Curiosity was oxygen to celebrity history, and history, in her case, had always belonged to other people as much as it belonged to her. The message had shifted her inner world, but it had not altered the outer world's appetite. She could feel it pressing faintly at the edges, not yet aware of what it wanted, but always searching. The first sign was small and almost laughably ordinary. A journalist, someone she had met before at events and who had always treated her politely, sent a message through an intermediary asking whether there was any truth to new archival discoveries at Graceland. The wording was careful, casual, the kind of inquiry that pretends not to know anything while clearly knowing something. Lisa Marie read the message twice, then set her phone down slowly. She understood immediately how information moved in circles. It did not require betrayal to travel. It only required loose words in a hallway, a passing comment between staff, a hint overheard and reshaped. The journalist had not mentioned a tape. They had not mentioned a message. They had used a neutral phrase, archival discoveries, as if they were talking about a forgotten stage costume or an unreleased rehearsal track. But Lisa Marie knew better. The world could smell novelty, and novelty was always profitable. She did not panic. Panic had never served her well. Instead, she called a private meeting with a small circle of people who had access to the archive. The tone of the meeting was calm, not accusatory. She did not threaten or interrogate. She simply reminded them that privacy was not an obstacle to business but a form of respect. She spoke about boundaries not as defensive walls but as necessary protections. She did not reveal the content of the recording, but she made it clear that some items in the archive were permanently private and that any suggestion otherwise would be a violation of trust. She watched their faces carefully, looking not for guilt but for understanding. Most nodded solemnly. One or two looked mildly disappointed. That disappointment did not surprise her. Disappointment was the language of a system trained to maximize exposure. But she did not waver. The tape was not a product. It was not a release. It was not a gift for fans, no matter how devoted they were. It was a father's voice speaking to his daughter, and that distinction mattered. Still, even after reinforcing security, the unease did not entirely disappear. It lingered like a faint draft under a closed door. Lisa Marie began to imagine worst-case scenarios, not dramatic conspiracies, but simple human error. A technician mishandling a file, a mislabeled box, a curious archivist making a backup for safety. She had witnessed how easily good intentions could morph into breaches. Fame rarely collapses under malicious attack. More often it erodes under the weight of assumption. People assume access is acceptable. People assume that what belongs to a public figure belongs, in part, to the public. She had spent her life watching that assumption operate unchecked. The tape represented something different. It represented the only space where Elvis Presley had not been public property. If she allowed that to dissolve, even accidentally, then the message would become one more artifact stripped of its context, debated by strangers who would dissect tone and speculate about meaning without understanding the intimacy of its origin. One evening in late October, she returned to Graceland without notifying anyone except the minimal security required. The house after hours had always felt like a separate world, a quieter dimension that existed beneath the tour narratives. She walked through dim corridors with a familiarity that belonged to memory rather than tourism. The walls, lined with framed photographs, reflected a life that had been both extraordinary and isolating. She paused in front of an image of herself as a child sitting on her father's knee, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She studied his expression carefully. There was joy there, yes, but also fatigue. There was pride, but also vulnerability. She had seen those layers before, but after hearing the tape, they seemed sharper, more human. The message had peeled away the distance created by myth. It had not rewritten history, it had reframed her relationship to it. She made her way to the secure archive room and requested that the tape be brought out again. The archivist on duty hesitated only briefly before complying. The reel was placed in her hands, still sealed in its protective casing. The physicality of it startled her. It was heavier than she remembered. She ran her thumb gently along the edge, aware that inside this small object lived the voice that had steadied her in the months since she first heard it. She did not ask to play it. She did not need to. The words had embedded themselves in her memory with surprising clarity. "You are not responsible for carrying my name." That sentence echoed more often than any other, particularly when she felt herself slipping back into old habits of defense and explanation. The tape had become a compass, not a relic. Yet as she held it that night, a new understanding surfaced. The power of the message did not reside in the magnetic strip wound around that reel. It resided in the transformation it had sparked inside her. The object was a container, not the essence, and containers can be stolen, duplicated, or corrupted. Essence cannot. She realized that the more she relied on the physical tape as proof of his love, the more vulnerable she felt. Love proven by an object is fragile. Love remembered internally is resilient. That thought frightened her at first. Letting go of the object would mean trusting her memory entirely. Memory fades. Memory blurs. Memory can be questioned. But perhaps the point was not to preserve his voice in perfect fidelity. Perhaps the point was to allow his intention to live through her actions. The decision did not arrive in a single flash. It unfolded slowly over several weeks of reflection and restless nights. She spoke with no one about it. She did not seek advice because she knew that advice would inevitably drift toward preservation. People value artifacts. People archive history obsessively, afraid that letting go means disrespect. But she had begun to see that preservation can also become possession, and possession can distort love. The tape had fulfilled its purpose. It had delivered his words when she was ready to hear them. It had released her from a burden she did not know she was carrying. Keeping it indefinitely might shift its meaning from bridge to anchor. She did not want to anchor herself to grief again, even if that grief now carried tenderness instead of confusion. In early December, as the year drew toward its quiet close, she invited Daniel Harper back to Graceland under the pretense of thanking him once more. Daniel arrived with the same understated humility he had shown from the beginning. They sat together in a private room near the garden, the winter air thin and cool beyond the windows. Lisa Marie placed the metal case on the table between them. Daniel looked at it but did not reach for it. He sensed the gravity of the moment without needing explanation. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She told him how the message had changed her, how it had shifted the way she saw herself and her father. She told him that she felt lighter now, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been reframed. Daniel listened without interruption. When she finished, she said something that startled even her as she spoke it. It did what it was meant to do. Daniel nodded softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He did not argue. He did not plead for preservation. He did not speak about historical value or legacy. He said only, "Some things are meant to be carried in the heart." That sentence settled over the room like quiet agreement. Lisa Marie opened the case and lifted the reel carefully, almost reverently. The tape caught the dim light, its surface reflecting a faint sheen. For a moment she hesitated. Not because she doubted her choice, but because she wanted to honor the weight of it fully. Destroying the tape would not erase her father's voice from history. His songs would continue to play. His performances would continue to circulate. What she was choosing to erase was the private bridge that only she had crossed. She was choosing to protect that crossing from ever being commodified. They walked together to a secluded corner of the garden where no tour passed and no cameras lingered. The winter air carried a slight chill, and the trees stood bare, their branches thin against the sky. Lisa Marie had arranged for a small controlled fire pit to be prepared, not dramatic, not ceremonial, simply practical. She did not want spectacle. She wanted closure. Daniel remained a respectful distance away as she knelt and held the reel over the low flame. For a moment she simply stared at it, absorbing the reality of what she was about to do. The tape had traveled from 1977 to 2019 intact. It had survived decades in storage. It had waited patiently for her readiness. And now, in a quiet garden far from cameras, it would complete its journey. When the edge of the reel touched the flame, the plastic began to warp almost immediately. A faint curl of smoke rose, thin and sharp. The magnetic strip darkened and shriveled, its stored sound dissolving into heat. Lisa Marie did not cry the way she had the first time she heard the message. Her tears now were different, steady, intentional, almost grateful. She whispered softly, not for anyone else to hear but for herself. She thanked her father for trusting her. She thanked him for choosing honesty over performance in that final recording. She promised him she would live the freedom he had urged her toward. She did not ask for more time. She did not ask for another chance to hear his voice. She understood that the voice had already done its work. As the last fragments of tape melted into ash, she felt a strange surge of calm. The risk was gone. The vulnerability had been sealed. The message now existed only where it was meant to exist, in her memory, in her actions, in the way she chose to raise her children and navigate her life. Daniel stepped forward only when the flame had died down completely. He did not comment on the symbolism of what had just occurred. He did not dramatize it. He simply stood beside her in silence. Lisa Marie brushed the ash gently with a stick until it scattered into fine gray dust. She felt no regret. She felt no panic. Instead, she felt an unexpected sense of completion. The tape had not been destroyed out of fear. It had been released out of love. By eliminating the object, she had protected the intention. No journalist would ever debate its authenticity. No collector would ever bid on it. No documentary would ever splice it into a narrative. It remained sacred precisely because it no longer existed in a form that could be consumed. In the months that followed, Lisa Marie noticed how differently she responded to questions about her father. She no longer felt defensive when people speculated. She no longer felt obligated to correct every misconception. She understood that history would always carry multiple interpretations, and she no longer needed to fight that. The tape had given her something far more important than clarification. It had given her confidence in what she knew privately. She did not need public agreement to validate her relationship with her father. She carried that validation internally now, immune to headlines and commentary. The destruction of the tape had not erased him. It had freed her from the fear of losing him again. There were moments, of course, when she wondered what it would have been like to keep it, to preserve it for her children to hear someday. But each time that thought surfaced, she returned to the original intention. The message had been for her, not for history, not for inheritance. She believed her children would know their grandfather through stories and music and the quiet ways she carried his influence. They did not need to hear his final private words to understand that he loved deeply. Love could be demonstrated through how she lived, not through artifacts she preserved. The tape's absence became a quiet testament to that belief. By the end of 2019, the world's curiosity had shifted elsewhere, as it always does. News cycles move quickly. Speculation fades when not fed. The journalist who had inquired earlier moved on to another project. The archive returned to its routine operations. Graceland continued welcoming visitors. Nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred. No announcement had been made. No public story had broken. And yet inside Lisa Marie, a profound transformation had taken place. She had faced the rarest kind of choice. The choice between possession and protection, and she had chosen protection. Not because she feared exposure, but because she valued intimacy more than visibility. In quiet moments, she sometimes revisited the garden in her mind, recalling the faint curl of smoke rising into cold air. She did not see it as loss. She saw it as completion. The message had traveled across decades to reach her at the right time. It had done what it was meant to do, and in releasing it, she had honored both the love behind it and the freedom it had encouraged. She no longer felt tethered to a relic. She felt anchored in something steadier, an understanding that her father's legacy was not a tape, not a museum, not a brand. It was a relationship. And relationships, even when interrupted by death, do not require physical proof to endure. The fire in that winter garden had consumed more than plastic and magnetic strip. It had consumed fear. It had consumed vulnerability. It had sealed a promise between father and daughter that did not require witnesses. And in its place, it left something simpler and stronger: peace. When the new year arrived in 2020, it did not announce itself with revelation or applause. It came quietly, like most turning points do, carrying no visible evidence that anything extraordinary had already happened. To the outside world, Lisa Marie Presley remained what she had always been: Elvis Presley's daughter, custodian of a cultural legacy, a public figure navigating her own private complexities. But inside her, something fundamental had shifted in the months since she heard and released the message. The destruction of the tape had not erased her father's voice. Instead, it had clarified it. Without the physical object anchoring her to a vault or archive, the message lived within her in a different way. It was no longer something she protected from the world. It was something she allowed to shape how she moved through it. She began to notice the difference in ordinary situations. When reporters asked familiar questions about her father's final years, she no longer felt the internal tightening that used to accompany those interviews. She did not correct every detail, nor did she retreat into rehearsed answers. Instead, she spoke calmly and simply, choosing words that honored him without turning him into a spectacle. There was a steadiness in her tone that surprised even her. She no longer felt like she was defending a monument. She felt like she was remembering a man. That distinction, subtle as it seemed, changed everything. People around her sensed it too, even if they could not name it. There was less friction in her responses, less visible strain. She had stopped fighting ghosts, both external and internal. The message had done something rare. It had untangled love from obligation. For decades, her identity had been woven tightly with preservation. Preserve the estate, preserve the image, preserve the mythology. She had inherited not only a father's name, but an entire infrastructure built to sustain it. That infrastructure was not malicious. It was practical, economic, cultural. But it was also relentless. Every choice she made was evaluated through the lens of what would Elvis have wanted. Or what does this do to the legacy? The tape had cut through that chorus with one simple directive: "You are not responsible for carrying my name." That sentence echoed differently now. It no longer felt like permission granted in theory. It felt like a command she was finally brave enough to obey. In the spring of 2020, as the world slowed unexpectedly under the weight of global uncertainty, Lisa Marie found herself with more time than she had experienced in years. The usual rhythms of events and appearances paused. Travel diminished. Noise softened. The enforced stillness felt strangely familiar, almost like the quiet hallways of Graceland after hours. She spent long afternoons writing, not memoir in the traditional sense, but reflections she never intended to publish. She wrote about the contrast between public memory and private memory. She wrote about what it meant to grow up with strangers claiming ownership over your grief. She wrote about how her father's laughter sounded different when he thought no one was listening. She wrote about the garden fire in December and the clarity it had brought. Writing became less about shaping narrative and more about shaping understanding. During those months, she also began speaking differently with her children. The message had softened something in her parenting. She became more deliberate about separating love from expectation. She told them explicitly that their lives were not meant to fulfill anyone else's story, not even hers. She watched their faces when she said it, noticing the slight confusion that comes when a child is told they owe nothing in return for love. That idea runs counter to so much of human conditioning. But she repeated it gently and often. She did not mention the tape. She did not recount its exact words. She simply lived its intention. She wanted her children to grow up without the invisible ledger that had followed her, an accounting of how well she had carried a name she never chose but always bore. As the years passed, the absence of the tape ceased to feel like a loss and instead became a quiet strength. There were no leaks to manage, no speculation to deflect. The private remained private. Occasionally she wondered if she would someday regret the decision, if time might dull her memory and she would wish for the clarity of hearing his voice again. But each time that thought surfaced, she realized something important. The most powerful parts of the message were not auditory. They were emotional. She could not perfectly reconstruct his tone or the exact rhythm of his breath near the microphone, but she did not need to. She remembered how the words made her feel, seen, released, trusted. Feeling is more durable than sound. Sound fades, feeling endures. In 2021, she returned to the garden where the fire had burned, this time alone. The trees were fuller, leaves catching sunlight instead of winter frost. She stood in roughly the same place and looked at the ground, though no visible trace remained of what had happened there. The earth had absorbed the ash. Nature had continued without ceremony. She realized how fitting that was. Some of the most significant acts of love leave no monument. They leave only transformation. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to revisit the memory of holding the reel over flame. The image no longer carried tension. It carried gratitude. She understood now that letting go had not diminished the connection to her father. It had strengthened it by removing fear from the equation. She was no longer guarding an object. She was living a promise. Public life, of course, did not stop being complex. There were still opinions, still commentary, still assumptions. There were still days when being Elvis Presley's daughter felt like standing under a spotlight she had not requested. But the difference was internal. She no longer felt obligated to correct every misinterpretation or defend every historical nuance. She knew something the world did not know, and that knowledge did not demand validation. It simply existed. It grounded her. The tape had given her a private certainty that insulated her from external noise. She had heard him. She had understood him. And she had honored him in the most intimate way possible by choosing discretion over display. In interviews during her later years, when she was asked about her father's legacy, she began answering in ways that surprised longtime observers. Instead of discussing record sales or cultural impact, she spoke about humanity. She spoke about imperfection. She spoke about how complicated people can be and how love can coexist with flaws. Some listeners interpreted her tone as maturity. Others saw it as distance, but she knew it was something else entirely. It was peace. Peace not with every chapter of the past, but with her place inside it. She no longer needed to resolve every contradiction publicly. She understood that history is rarely tidy and that reconciliation often happens privately, away from microphones. As she approached 2023, she carried both fragility and strength in equal measure. Life had not been easy. There had been loss, disappointment, struggle. The world saw glimpses of those chapters and formed conclusions, but internally the message from 1977 continued to anchor her. It reminded her that she was not required to be a monument. She was allowed to be a person. When she felt overwhelmed by expectations, she returned to that core truth. When she questioned her worth outside the Presley identity, she remembered that her father had valued her simply as his daughter. That memory did not erase hardship, but it softened its edges. In her final months, there were evenings when she would sit quietly, not speaking, simply reflecting. Those close to her noticed a calmness that had not always been there. It was not the absence of pain, it was the presence of acceptance. She had spent decades wrestling with unanswered questions about her father's final years, about what he had felt, about whether he had known how deeply she loved him. The tape had answered at least one of those questions with clarity. He had loved her. Not as an extension of his brand, not as a symbol of continuity, but as his child. That knowledge steadied her in ways that others could not see but could sense. When she passed in January 2023, tributes flooded in from around the world. Fans remembered her as a link to an era, as the daughter of a legend. Friends remembered her humor and loyalty. Her children remembered her strength. None of them knew about the fire in the garden or the tape that had existed and then vanished. They did not need to. The evidence of its impact was visible in the way she had lived her final years, with a quieter confidence, a gentler perspective, a refusal to let public expectation dictate private truth. The world mourned her publicly, but the deepest understanding of her transformation remained unspoken, carried only by memory and by the earth that had absorbed the ash. Graceland continued to welcome visitors. The tour continued. The music continued. The story of Elvis Presley remained vibrant, debated, celebrated. But somewhere within those walls, invisible and unrecorded, existed a different legacy, one not cataloged in archives or displayed in glass cases. It was the legacy of a father who had chosen to speak plainly to his daughter, and of a daughter who had chosen to protect that plainness from the noise of the world. It was the legacy of restraint in an age of exposure, of intimacy in a culture of spectacle. The tape was gone, but its intention endured. In the end, what remained was not an artifact, but an understanding. Love does not require proof to be real. It does not require preservation to endure. It requires only recognition. Lisa Marie had recognized her father's intention when she was ready, and she had responded with her own act of intention in return. Their exchange, separated by decades, existed outside public record and beyond commercial value. It was complete in itself. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath every legend. Beneath the lights and applause, beneath the debates and documentaries, there are moments of unrecorded humanity that matter more than anything that survives on tape. Those moments are not meant for the world. They are meant for the heart.